Hey friends, welcome to Thus Saith the Lloyd. This is Gene Lloyd, and I'm so glad you're here today because I want to get into a topic that is never controversial and that every Christian always agrees upon, and that's the topic of which Bible version is the best one to use. Of course, it is controversial, but I don't think it needs to be. So, at least in most situations. So, let's dig into this together. Okay, is there really a version of the Bible that's perfect? Well, I think that if you know the ancient languages, if you know ancient Greek and ancient Aramaic and ancient Hebrew, then the answer is you could just go back to the original texts if you can get your hands on them, and you can study those. You can study the original Old Testament in Hebrew and a little Aramaic. You can study the New Testament in Greek, and there you go. That's all you need. But if you don't know those languages, which is most of us, then you have to find a translation that is in the language you understand. And so the challenge we often have, that most people have, is which version do I choose? Which one do I use? Is there one that's better or worse? And these are the kind of questions I'd like to answer today. But before we go any further, do me a favor, click that like button, subscribe, follow. We're building something new here. We're trying to get this out into as many people as possible. We'd love to get this content out to more people. So do me a favor and click all those buttons for us so that we can get it out to more, okay? Now, let me tell you this story. I knew somebody once who would use a different version of the Bible every year. So one year he might use the New International Version. Another year he might use the King James Version. Another year he might use the New American Standard. And one of the reasons he did this is because he found that by reading the Bible in a different translation each year, it gave him different angles and perspectives on those verses. Growing up, we often memorize a lot of scripture verses, and I can still quote a lot of verses from, I think mostly we used King James Version when I was growing up. And so I have a lot of verses memorized in King James. And sometimes I'll quote those and I'll think, well, that's not the version that I'm used to anymore. And so I think it's good to have these different versions from that perspective to really be able to get different angles and perspectives on different passages. And really, I'll tell you, my hat goes off to those who have spent years learning the ancient languages, translating those languages into these different versions. It's a really big project, and I'm thankful that they've created content that we can understand today. And the more that I study modern Hebrew, I'm even more impressed. I'm even more impressed with the level of work that goes into these translations. So I'm super thankful. In fact, I think it's really good to pause and consider that we have something available to us today that is just incredible. And we should recognize that. We should recognize how valuable it is that we have these. And we should recognize how valuable it is that we can just pick up many different versions of the Bible and use them on a regular basis. So consider that as you're going through deciding what you want to read, okay? So I think maybe the best way to approach this topic is to go all the way back into history and look at where the original source documents came from, how those got translated over the years, how it went from Hebrew and Greek to Latin to English to other languages. But that would be a very long history lesson, and we really don't have time for that here. We want to keep it a little bit shorter. So if you like that idea, you want to go deeper, just click the link down in the description below and read my article that I've written about the best Bible versions. But don't run away just yet. Stick around for a few minutes so you can get my recommendations, okay? So there is a shorter version of the history lesson. That shorter version is basically that all of the modern translations we have today came from those ancient sources or from sources that translated from those ancient sources. So they all kind of connect back to that point. And it's important to recognize too that those translations were done by highly skilled linguists, okay? These weren't just average people. These are people who really understood the language, and some even died. If you really go back and you read my article, some died because they dared to translate the Bible, because they wanted to put it in English and make it available to all people. So again, we should recognize how fortunate we are today to have these translations available to us. Now, one key thing I'd like to cover in this video are the different categories of those translations. We have all these different versions, right? All these different translations. How can we categorize? How can we choose? It's really not about what's better or worse. It's really just about the categories. And so what we do is we categorize the different Bible versions along this spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum, we call them word for word. And on another side of the spectrum, we call them thought for thought. And we do this because there are different methods and approaches for translating or transliterating biblical text. Okay, and so word for word, when we say that, what we mean is that they're translations that aim to give us a more literal, direct translation, to take the original Hebrew word or the original Greek word and convert it into English or French or whatever language the translators are working with as literally and directly as possible. Now, when they do this, it tends to preserve that complexity within the text, but it also can make it a little harder to read sometimes. So we have a trade-off there, complexity without as much simplicity in the reading. It's also a process that it keeps the interpretive bias from sneaking in. You get very little interpretive bias when you're working with a word-for-word translation. So I like to use these, and I tell people, use these for in-depth Bible studies. These are the ones you want to go to when you want to get really deep, when you want to really understand, what does this verse mean? How does it connect to this other passage over here? What does it mean when it says this over here? It's good for really in-depth studies, okay? Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the thought for thought translations aim for trying to convey more of a thought or a message that's in the text. And so it trades that complexity that you find in word for a little more clarity, for a little more simplicity in reading. But the challenge is some interpretive bias can slip in because, we just have to recognize that different thoughts can be conveyed in different ways. And so one person may take a particular passage and translate it this way, and another person may translate it slightly differently because the thought they think is conveyed in a different way. And so we get a little bit more interpretive bias that sneaks into these versions, not on purpose. I don't think people aren't intentionally trying to change scripture or implement or put in their interpretive bias in there, but it just happens because of the way that we translate scriptures. Okay, so these versions, these thought for thought versions, I think are best for devotions or to provide us with some peripheral clarity when we're reading those more complex passages. We can jump into a thought for thought version and then get a different perspective and a different angle and see it worded differently. So that's really good. Not really the best for deep Bible studies. I wouldn't use them for that, but good for those times where you just want to read through and have devotional time, right? So you might be wondering, well, what are these different versions? Let me give you a couple of examples. On the word for word side, King James Version, New American Standard Bible, the Amplified Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. Those are all some of the common word for word that you may have heard of. There's others out there, but those are some of the more common ones. And on thought for thought, we have things like the New International Version, the New Living Translation, the NCV version. These are all some common thought for thought ones that are out there. So we also have these other ones that are more like paraphrase versions, like the Message or the Passion, which took a different perspective in translating the Bible. And I categorize these more of in a conversational style thought for thought. So I would put them in the thought for thought category, but further on along the spectrum because they tend to include more conversational type content or style. And I would say these are good for new believers. They're good for cursory kind of reading like devotionals, but I definitely wouldn't use these either for in-depth biblical studies, okay? We'll lose a little bit if we try to do that there. And so really what I suggest to people is get a good word-for-word translation. Get something you can use on a daily basis to study and to go deep. And then have a good thought-for-thought translation handy that you can go to whenever you hit those more difficult passages so you can look at it and see it written in a different way. This really helps out to give you a good balance. And so my personal go-to version is the New Revised Standard Version. I love that version. I've used that for years. Some people are all about, I just want King James Version. Some people are all about, I just want NIV. NRSV, New Revised Standard, that's been mine for a while that I really love. And that's my go-to every day to study out of. But now I also have about 30 or 40 different translations in my Bible software, so I can easily click on one of those whenever I want to see a verse written in a different way. And those span the range, word for word, thought for thought. They give me the whole range, and so I have a good chance to look at verses in different ways. But in this conversation, the important piece here is that we're studying the Bible, right? That's the most important piece. We're studying the Bible. We're drawing closer to Jesus. And what I always tell people as well is study it well, dig into it well, and you'll learn to be more like Jesus. That's our ultimate goal. Whether you're using NIV or KJV or NRSV, whatever, like our ultimate goal is to be more like Jesus. And so I wouldn't say there's one that's better or worse. I wouldn't say there's one that's good and one that's bad in those categories. I would say there's a spectrum there, and we can use them for different purposes and in different ways. But there's a lot of history involved. There's a lot of history, and so if you want to go deeper into that and get a better context, then follow that link in the description. Read my free article on the best Bible versions. I will give you a warning. It may make you want to go buy more translations. You may end up with more copies of the Bible in your house. So just be aware of that right up front, okay? So thus saith the Lord. I hope this was helpful for you. That's my perspective on this topic, and I'd love to hear your perspective. I'd love to hear what your favorite Bible version is. Are you a King James Version only person? Tell me about that. Tell me why. Put that in the comments below for me. Are you against paraphrase versions? Put that in the comments below. Let me know what you think about that. Just do me a favor and keep it civil. I love having these conversations, but we don't want to turn it into arguments, okay? We want to be able to sharpen each other, and so we can have great conversations and discussions about this stuff. And so also leave some notes on other passages. If there's Bible passages you want me to cover or other biblical topics you want me to cover, put that down in the notes so I can add that to my list, okay? We'll see you next time.